in the closing minutes of this session, I'd just like to give you just a very quick heads up on some of the future activities, particularly coming into 2019. It's been touched upon this morning, but one of the big areas of our focus as an organisation now is conformance. And you'll have heard us talk about the fact that we don't intend to take a trust mark forward, but we really do want to start looking at, if you will, conformance and certification that fits around the compliance framework. Obviously, as we heard from Chris earlier, one of the goals now is with this risk-based approach, we are far better suited to be able to address more than just the consumer market, which we see as a very important step forward. In terms of focus, as John illustrated on the piece about regulation, who's on the hook already, clearly there needs to be a business case. It's all very well coming up with a conformance program, but if vendors just can't see a business case for it, then it clearly wasn't going to get very far. So with the fact now, particularly a number of governments around the world, clearly in the first instance, we've been focusing, as Jeff mentioned, on the DCMS activities over the Code of Practice. We see that as being our first area. So, and in fact, the discussions initially for conformance are not necessarily conformance for all of the controls, but probably initially a subset, just simply to be able to make a start in this space and to be able to get a credible conformance story together and a process that vendors can use to be able to demonstrate conformance with a with a set of security requirements. And one of the questions we've been asked a number of times is, yes, but the DCMS isn't law yet. To which the answer is, it's certainly now an intent by the UK government, but more importantly, and it was mentioned this morning, how would you prove that you've done due diligence in your IoT product under the GDPR regulations? And this is an area where we see, this is one of the areas where we see the goal of this initial activity is to support vendors and service providers in terms of how would you actually, in the classic product liability perspective, how would you actually provide a defence from a GDPR perspective for your IoT product? So that's, if you like, the initial scope. The goal, as we've always done, is to try and make this as usable and as able to provide utility to you as vendors. And obviously, we know that there may well be other schemes to follow, but that will be our initial scope for 2019. So very quickly, in terms of the elements that will make up that conformance scheme, we already have the compliance framework, which obviously we've talked about a little bit in this session. We started to talk about context, James and Saab, in terms of the smart building. We've already done a fair bit in the consumer space. Jeff has talked about some of the best practice. So the goal here is to start putting the pieces together to be able to build a conformity assessment process, because clearly it's one thing having a framework, but we actually need to deliver a process which would allow somebody to be able to make a declaration of conformance. I won't go through all of the assessment pieces, but again, as Paul illustrated, one of the reasons we're using the term conformance is because it's already the process that's used for existing product declarations. So in terms of CE, if you want to issue demonstrate conformance for a product for CE, particularly safety is a good example, and we have to keep in mind that in some languages safety and security is the same word, that we should be following a very similar process. So the goal here is about looking at the kind of techniques that are used in the product conformance world to do something very similar in IoT security. It's probably also worth stating at this point that our current view is that whilst There have been noises about certifying every IoT product. We've had some great discussions with some of the world's major test labs. UL and TUV were on our panel last week at TechWorks. There's a clear recognition that the idea of certifying every consumer product is clearly impractical, quite apart from those who've been talking about trying to do common criteria on consumer product, which when a product life cycle is probably less than 2 years and the certification period of common criteria is 2 years, you can clearly see there's a disconnect. So one of the positioning pieces for this will be about developing for certain compliance classes, and I must stress that point, some consumer product may well be able to self-certify. Clearly there are other products where they are either more mission grade or they have a different risk profile where clearly external assessment carried out by certified bodies such as the test labs is clearly part and parcel of the conformance assessment scheme that we're starting to put together. Very quickly, so we've got the compliance framework. We have the assessment spreadsheet as Chris was describing. We are now, this is one of the major areas on the right, the test and conformance process is one of the major activities for Working Group 3. I would make a call out to anybody if you have an interest in this area. We'd be very interested to hear from you because we are looking to resource up this area. It's a major piece of work. One piece that's already in place is that with a compliance framework now going over to a risk-based process, we are now working on how one would actually come up with the risk factors, the CIA that Chris talked about earlier. I would stress we are not trying to reinvent risk assessments. There's plenty of those out there already. The aim of the context and risk factors work will be a white paper that helps you in terms of understanding what needs to come out of a risk assessment process in terms of the risk factors that Chris talked about in terms of confidentiality, integrity and availability. And then obviously that then helps in terms of how the conformance assessment will be carried out. So it isn't just about the compliance class, but in terms of the compliance class will also then start to inform what level of conformance might be required, whether it could be self-certification or if the compliance class is, say, higher than compliance class 1, for example, then clearly there may be certain elements of your product that would need either third-party assessment or testing. So that particular, the context and risk factor piece is ongoing. That's actually been carried out in Working Group 2, and there is a clear push that we will get that out in the first half of 2019. And at that point, I'm going to say thank you very much and to close this session. Thank you.